Seems like we have a lot of diversity. It's so nice to see everyone coming together.
It really is. Yeah, thank you all so much for introducing yourselves in the chat. Please feel free to keep doing so. We'll wait just about 1 or 2 more minutes to get everybody on before we get started. Awesome. Well, feel free to keep introducing yourselves. I'm just going to go ahead and get started. So thank you all so much for coming to our event today. Let me get my screen moved over. We are so excited here at the IUBMB Trainee Initiative to be hosting this event, Marketing Yourself for Academia and Industry. We are really excited to be hearing from Dr. Arjun Raj and Dr. Kyle Hess about their experiences, their career paths, and their advice for transitioning for your next step in academia and industry. Thank you all so much for coming here today. I'll go ahead and introduce the layout of our event so you know what to expect. First, I'll give just a brief introduction to the IUBMB Trainee Initiative. Then we'll turn it over to Dr. Arjun Raj for his talk about how to approach getting a postdoc. We'll then have a short Q&A section with Dr. Raj before moving on to Dr. Kyle Hess's talk about 5 tips to market your cutting-edge academic training to your future industry employer. We'll then do a Q&A session with Dr. Kyle Hess, followed by a joint question and answer session with both speakers to round out our event today. Also, thank you all so much for introducing yourselves in the chat. Please feel free to keep doing so as you enter. Just a note, all questions for our speakers should go in the Q&A tab on your Zoom, so that way we as moderators can monitor your questions and ask them to our speakers during the Q&A sessions. With this tab, you also can upvote certain questions. So if there's a question you really like and really would like to get asked, make sure to vote for it so that'll move it up to the top of our radar. Awesome. So briefly to introduce the IUBMB Trainee Initiative, we are an initiative by trainees for trainees, and our goal is to bring together scientists from around the world. We hope to put on events covering educational, technical, and professional development talks, and to bring together trainees from all different levels from around the world. And we do this by hosting events like the one today, and you also can keep up to date with our initiative by following us on social media and joining our mailing list through our website. We also on our website have access to all of our previous recordings. So if events like this are helpful to you and you're interested in checking out our previous ones, we recommend you look to our website. I also wanted to take a second to introduce the team that put on the event today. So we are representatives from the Pan American Association for Biochemistry and Molecular Biology. We have Bree Bible, who is our trainee ambassador. She is a postdoc at UCSF and soon to be visiting professor at St. Mary's College, California. We also have Sunny Kong, who's a PhD student at UC Berkeley. Kathy Cosma is an MCS student at BC Cancer Research Center. And my name's Hannah Fletcher, and I'm a PhD candidate at WashU in St. Louis. And finally, before we get started, we just wanted to let you know that if you're interested in getting involved with the IUBMB Trainee Initiative, we'll have applications this fall to join our leadership committee. So terms for the leadership committee members are 1 year, and to apply, you would submit a short statement of interest and a CV. We'll have more information about this in the coming months on our website and social media channels, so definitely stay tuned for more information. So again, just one quick reminder before we get started, all questions should go in the Q&A box rather than the chat. And with that, thank you all so much for joining, and I'll turn it over to Sunny to introduce our first speaker.
Hi, everyone. I'm excited to introduce Professor Arjun Raj from the University of Pennsylvania as our
representative from the academia side. His lab studies the biology of single cells on a single cell level. Yeah, and he'll be telling us a little bit about his career and tips. So I'll let him get started on that.
Yeah, thank you so much for inviting me, and I'm really happy to be talking with you all about what feels like a pretty big decision in your life, the transition from PhD to postdoc. Right, so I guess I'll start by telling you a little bit about my own journey. So I started college. I went to college at UC Berkeley. I got really interested in, I really wanted to do theoretical physics. So I started doing physics. I did a math double major, then I got really into math. And then at some point I realized I wasn't quite like smart enough to do math. So like, okay, why don't I do applied math? And so I took a year off for various reasons. And then I was applying to graduate school in math. I sort of barely got into NYU's applied math program where I did my PhD. Although I had kind of an interesting trajectory there. So I'm doing applied math. I was like, I've never want to do lab work in my entire life. But then somehow I got into mathematical biology. I think my dad suggested getting into that. I was like, okay. I don't even really know what that was. So I worked with Charlie Peskin, who was a very kind, brilliant mathematician at the Courant Institute, NYU's applied math department. And I said, I'm into all this molecular biology, like modeling of molecular biology, but I kind of feel like it would be good to work in a lab just to, keep it real. Never expecting to actually work in a lab. So he said, yeah, my son plays tennis with this guy and his dad runs a lab, some kind of strange thing. And I ended up doing a lot of my PhD in a lab for molecular biology in the lab of Fred Kramer and mostly Sanjay Tyagi I worked with very closely. He was my other grad advisor. And working in his lab was really a wonderful experience. I just fell in love with doing experiments actually, which was really cool. Right, so I was in his lab. I sort of did my PhD there and in the math department. It was odd. And then I was looking for postdocs. Now, that was the lab that I was in was kind of a small lab and, not as sort of like broadly known. It was at a small institute called the Public Health Research Institute, which actually no longer exists. It's been folded into various entities through the years. And so that was an interesting transition. I applied to, I think, maybe 3 or 4 postdoc positions. Of them, there was basically 2 that I was really interested in. Of all the places that I looked at, well, of the 2 that I was really interested in, I got one of them. I went and gave talks at different places. So I worked in the lab of Alexander van Oudenarden. It was kind of like, that was my choice because he was at MIT at the time. And so I went there for my postdoc. It was an interesting transition coming from a small, relatively less well-known institute to, MIT and the sort of big fancy lab. I'm happy to talk about that more. So I did a postdoc there for about 3.5 years, and then I started my faculty position at University of Pennsylvania in the bioengineering. And then now I'm jointly appointed between engineering and the School of Medicine in the genetics department. Our work is in single cell molecular biology to whatever extent that's relevant. I've done a lot of very interdisciplinary work through the years. And so that maybe, if people have questions about that, I'm happy to talk about that. Certainly doing interdisciplinary work poses some challenges when you're navigating between fields and like, how do you apply to a postdoc with that interdisciplinary background? It's something I'm happy to talk about. Since I've been at the University of Pennsylvania, I've been very active in various mentorship things. I've talked to a large number of different people. I've led graduate admissions, so I know what PhD admissions is like. I've had a number of postdocs in my lab. I've seen a number of postdocs. I serve as a postdoc liaison in the genetics department. So I get sort of my finger on the pulse of all the postdocs in the department. So those are kind of my perspectives, like I've been a postdoc and I've hired postdocs and I've, seen many such transitions. And, I want to leave as much time for questions at the end, which I feel like is probably going to be the most important thing. Oh, I would say another place where I have at least some level of knowledge, and I just, as a little advertising, I do a lot of one-on-one mentoring. So if you're ever interested, just send me an email and we'll find a time and I'll just talk to you. So I've done probably about 100 of those so far. It's been very illuminating. People from all over the world. I've talked to people all the way from undergrads up to tenured professors and everything in between, including a number of people who have been trying to navigate this transition between grad school and choosing a postdoc. And so, at least I have some data to sample from there. Okay, so I want to talk about maybe two things. One of the main things I want to say is that in the sort of upward funneling of positions, usually it's always like there are a lot of applicants and only a few spots. The PhD candidate or grad student to postdoc transition is one of the few places where actually, if you've done fairly well, you generally have a lot of leverage. In the sense that there's a lot of demand for postdocs, but there's, I think, less supply than demand. So you can actually have a lot, you can have a lot more choices than you do. Like, so for instance, faculty positions hard to get, getting into grad school can be difficult, so forth. But it's one of the career transitions where actually you may have more choices. Consequently, I think it's good to spend, so you're going to have some number of choices, hopefully, if you set this up properly. And so one of the big questions, I think, for postdocs is, how do I choose between labs or choose labs that you're going to target for doing a postdoc? And so one of the main things you want to do is say, like, okay, what do you want to do next? Spend some time thinking about why you want to do that, and then choose a lab which will be hopefully a good fit for that. And you definitely want to target several labs to start, because you never know which one's going to feel right or which one has funding to accept you or is interested. There's some mutual connection there of some kind. I think that's one of the biggest things. So I was going to talk with a little, how do you find these labs and so forth. One of the things I've realized over the course of many years of giving advice is that, the more I know, the less I feel qualified to give any advice about everything, because there's counterexamples to virtually every possible bit of advice people are going to give you. So, trust your instincts on some level. But I can tell you some common failure modes are where people sort of say things where they're like, I think that was maybe a mistake. So, anyway, I'll try and maybe give some tips in that vein as well. So one of the most important, so when you're going for a postdoc, generally some people do postdocs first off for all kinds of reasons. So some people are interested in a purely academic career path, meaning that they want to, become a faculty member. Some people want to do a postdoc to go to industry, like that's maybe less common. Maybe your ideas change over time, but that does happen, totally happen. Some people do postdocs just because they need a little more time to be in this. It's sort of inertia. You're used to academia, just like, okay, I'll stay in academia a little longer. That's also fine. Like, I think there's like a lot of judgment out there about, the reason why you do something. And, if it's working for you at the time, that's fine. Don't worry about it. Other people can worry about that, kind of get worked up about it, but you have to think about what's good for you at the time. One of the other things I would say is that these are temporary positions. Like, they're really not, like, being a postdoc is not like a job you're getting for life, and that creates a couple of different I think it's important going into it with at least some sort of a goal. You have to be flexible about it because obviously situations change and so forth. But, if your goal, for instance, is to get an academic position, then you really should approach your postdoc with that in mind because, it's meant to be a temporary position. I personally feel that our training times have gotten unreasonably long, and it would be good to have people kind of like get postdoc times should be shorter, and I think they can be shorter if you have a reasonable goal of what you want to get out of it when you go in. Okay, so one of the things that when I'm thinking about like where people make some mistakes sometimes in choosing postdocs, I think you want to pick postdoc labs or like potential labs. Often you'll read a lot of papers in the field about some topic that you're very interested in, and you think like, wow, this is an amazing lab and all of that, and I want to join that lab because they're publishing all these awesome papers. And that can sometimes be a little bit of a recipe for disaster because if you're choosing based on the sort of topic and the publications and so forth, you might be in for a rude awakening when you go to the lab and find a relatively toxic environment. That may or may not be the case, but it's really important to check that ahead of time. Sorry, I was going to say one more thing about goals, but although it sort of relates to this. When you're a PhD student, an extreme version of this is I think when you're a PhD student, it's really important to choose a postdoc based on who the mentor is, the people, the overall feel of the lab, and much less important like the specific topic, because you want to have a good experience, you want to learn a lot, gain a lot of mentorship and technical skill and just scientific skill. In the postdoc, you have to be a bit more strategic about the topic. So you could go to the most amazing mentor, publishes great papers, but if the field is a little out of date, and I've seen this, you could have a harder time getting an academic position afterwards because people are like, yeah, that's great work, great lab, great whatever, but like, we're just not as excited about this topic. And I've definitely seen that occur, from my role, even looking at faculty applications. So that's one thing. You can't just solely go based on the mentorship. I think you have to also go based on, a bit of like, okay, where is the field headed? What's going to be exciting and new? And you have to make an informed decision in that regard as well. So you have to weigh both of these factors. I think the good news is that, there are both positive and like good lab environments and good topics exist for almost everything. But it does mean that you need to do your homework beyond just reading papers and journals and deciding based on that. I think it's important to really get a sense of what is a lab like, and keep in mind you're interested both in like, is this an enjoyable place to work? And at the same time, is it going to get me my goals, whatever those goals are? And generally the goal is getting papers in as little time as possible, right? So you want to have markers of, academic success so that you can go on and get the job or get whatever it is that you want to get. So, so how are you going to like find potential labs? So obviously reading papers is a good thing. You get a sense of like who's doing what. If you can go to a conference and actually meet people, that's a really good way. Sometimes you're like, no way. And you can get a sense of also watch their interactions with other people, especially people within their own lab, and you can get a good sense. Talk to people from the lab. I mean, you don't want to be explicitly like, is so-and-so toxic? But, you can get a sense, hopefully, of like what their lab environment is like just from these informal interactions. So that's a good place to look. You want to check also, the record of placement. So how many people who have been in that lab have gone on to get faculty positions or whatever it is that you're interested in. You want to especially check like how long did it take them, how many papers. Sometimes, maybe you don't mind doing a 6 or 7 year postdoc, and that's fine, right? Then like, if that's what the record is. There are some labs that are great labs, great lab environments. It just takes 6 or 7 years. PI is pretty upfront about it. You just want to go in there. If your timeline was like 2 or 3 years and you go in there and it ends up being 6 years, you can't say I didn't know if that's what the record has been. So I think it's really important to check that and make sure it aligns with your interests. Sometimes, and now this really depends on the PI, but you might be able to just have to even just informally attend a group meeting, just write to them, say, hey, you know, I'm interested, you know, ask to just attend a group meeting, get some feel for how things work now that, you know, virtual is an option for so many things. That may be worth doing. So one other thing is, you know, when to reach out to people. And I would say the issue that I've seen more often is people actually apply almost too early. So I've had people inquire about my lab like a year and a half ahead of graduate, 2 years. I'm like, you know, a lot can change in a couple of years, and it's pretty hard to make an informed decision for either party at that point. So I would say that, you know, you're better off looking maybe like sort of 1 year to 6 months ahead of time. You know, I think that's probably the best way to do it. Informally, if you meet someone at a conference and, you know, you give a talk and someone shows interest, or you meet someone, show some interest, you can say, oh, you know, I'll be looking for postdocs in a couple of years, and then that kind of puts you on the radar. But in terms of like formally, like, okay, here's my statement of interest and my CV and so forth, you know, I wouldn't do that too far in advance, because I think that just, you know, it's just hard for people to know what to do. And I think some number of PhD mentoring committees are like, oh, reach out early, you know, because it's like what early bird gets over, but at some point it's just ridiculous. So anyway, that's my thought on it. Yeah, so, you know, think about number of years. Sorry, I'm just looking over my notes here on what to talk about. So one of the things, and you know, so I posted on Twitter a bit about, you know, what are potential questions that people have, and there are things about like, you know, switching fields and so forth. And, you know, I think often switching fields is great. The main thing is just to show what I look for in a PhD candidate is I'm looking for the ability to complete projects. Like, have you during your PhD been able to take a cool idea and actually turn it into a paper at the end of a PhD? And if you can do it multiple times, all the better. So, you know, if you're able to do it in one field and you're switching to another field, what I'll tell people is, you know, it'll probably take a year and a half of extra, because, you know, you're learning a new area, as opposed to just kind of like, you know, hitting the ground running. But if you're okay with it, then that's fine. So I think switching fields is actually like fairly easy to do. Obviously, the bigger the switch, the sort of more incongruous it might seem. But, you know, people are looking for postdocs to help them expand their knowledge base in the lab and so forth. So I think it's actually, you know, much more like, I would certainly not talk yourself out of applying to something because you feel like you're too far out of the field. At the same time, I would say, I've had people from different fields apply to my lab, but then they were kind of like superficially interested in what we were doing. They were like, oh, I'm interested in single cell. I'm like, okay, well, like what specifically from our work? And they're just kind of say, well, single cell. I was like, okay, this is not, you know, they kind of, it was clear they didn't do any homework, or it was unclear that they had any real concrete interests in the lab, and that definitely came across negatively. So if you are looking to switch fields, be sure to, you know, like as you're applying for postdocs or you're talking to the PI, like have some genuine interest or genuine, you know, whatever. It's also, let's see, so which kind of lab to join? So there's always these debates between, should I join the big famous lab that might have, you know, less one-on-one mentorship, but has a lot of prestige and clout and so forth? Or should I join the small lab where I might get more mentorship? And, you know, there's a lot of dichotomies that I think are a little bit false here. I've seen people survive and thrive in either environment. So I've seen people go to, you know, a small lab and have not much mentorship. I've definitely seen that, and certainly in some of the phone calls I've fielded, I've seen that sort of thing. And I've seen people go to small labs and, it's harder to get their papers published, but I've also seen people go to small labs and get awesome papers published. And, I can say from the faculty hiring perspective, when I look at someone who went to a lab that's perhaps less, famous, and then they publish a really great paper from it, I'm like, that's actually even better than the, famous person who gets their paper in all the fancy journals. But that said, if someone goes to a fancy lab and gets their paper in a fancy journal, if the paper is good, I read it and take a look and it's a nice paper and they really did something cool, that's also great. And also sometimes in big labs, you can get great mentorship, and it's not just from the PI who, sometimes I've heard of PIs who are pretty active and engaged in labs of 50 plus. It just depends on the person and their capacity. You also in large labs get a lot of mentorship from the other people in the lab. So it's really important to get a sense of like how collaborative the environment is. Those are the sorts of things that happen on a visit. So I can talk a little bit about the logistics of this. So let's say you figure out what lab you want to apply to. You send them an email, hopefully a short one. Be sure to attach your CV. Highlight any publications is like especially an important thing. Then hopefully they'll set up, what I do at least, I set up a Zoom call, talk with them, see if it's going to make sense. And then if, and sometimes I'll have multiple Zoom calls, and then I'll bring them in for a visit. And the visit, they'll come for the day, they'll meet different people in the lab. They will, I'll meet with them a few times. They'll give a talk about their work. And basically all of these things are evaluative for me. So I'm looking at the science that they present. I'm looking at their interactions with other people in the lab, and I follow up in lab with all the people about, okay, well, you met with this person, what were your impressions and so forth. And I really place a lot of weight on that because it's really important for me that, they get along with my lab as a team and not just, as a scientist. So a lone scientist. So those are some of my evaluative things. The other thing that I'm really looking for is, again, the ability to finish projects. So when they come in, do they have a record of success, or do they have a clear plan for like, here are the papers that I'm going to do? Of course, there are mitigating circumstances, and I will, of course, take those into account, but barring mitigating factors of, various kinds, like how many papers you get published is a pretty strong indicator of, how your ultimate productivity. And that's a lesson I've learned time and time again. So I think that is a really important thing. I'm also looking for someone with just energy and enthusiasm. I feel like that goes an enormous way. So that's pretty important in terms of getting hired, at least in my lab. I'm cognizant of issues that face certain groups. There's certain groups that have not had the privileges and advantages of other groups. So that's definitely an important factor for me. It's also important for funding. So often there are funding sources that are allocated directly towards those people, and that can sometimes make it easier to get a position in a lab that might not otherwise have funding for a position. So one of the things also is that, funding has been flat or down in real terms. And meanwhile, salaries have gone up for a lot of postdoc positions, which is generally great, but it means also that I think there are just going to be fewer positions available. But again, if you have some way of attracting funding through any number of different mechanisms, that can be a really, I think more than ever, that can help you kind of write your own ticket as to where you want to go. Certainly once you start a postdoc, I would definitely apply for funding. So anyway, you go in for this visit, and then typically, the PI will make a decision that either on the spot or sometime in the future, if they're deciding between, or they need to mull it over or whatever it might be. On that visit, just stay really positive. When it comes to things like negotiating about like salary and benefits, usually I would say wait until an offer is in hand or someone sort of verbally commits. If they bring it up, if the PI brings it up to you, let that conversation happen. But, on some level, you need to, those discussions are sometimes better to have after the visit's over and you kind of have a sense of it, and also what all of your different options are when you're weighing them. Also, one of the things that I would keep in mind about things like, salary and benefits and so forth is that these are temporary positions. It's important that people are, paid as well as people are able to pay them. And obviously cost of living in some desirable places is extremely high. And, no doubt you have to think about how much those salaries are and so forth in terms of what you're able to afford. Keep in mind, though, that this position is temporary, and whatever your next position is, hopefully will pay more. So where this becomes a factor is if you're thinking like, okay, I want postdoc A positions to be much better to job X than postdoc B would. If job X is what your real goal is, then, even if A maybe pays a bit less, sorry, temporary allergy. Even if job A, postdoc A pays a bit less, it may be worth, doing in the long term, because that's, where you want to go with things. So that's pretty important. Another thing to keep in mind is social media. I know in this day and age, I'm sure many of you have seen various people on Twitter and so forth. Feel free, obviously it's a free country, speak your mind on Twitter. Just keep in mind that, people do look. I'm constantly surprised how many people who I don't see on Twitter at all. And then I talk to them and they're like, I was very upset by your tweet. Or they're like, oh, I had no idea. I have tenure, it doesn't matter. And I certainly don't say censor yourself in any way, shape, or form, but those people are paying attention. So just be cognizant of that, which I think is generally good life advice, outside of this particular context. But anyway, just wanted to say that. So I'm done rambling. I would be happy to take any questions.
Thank you for sharing those tips. Some of the questions have already been partially answered. So that's great. There's one that has been upvoted a lot, and it kind of, you have touched on it already, but maybe you can give more advice on how you would go about selling yourself to a prospective PI when specifically you're looking to transition to a role where you don't have the background, but you want to learn and adapt to a new field or new techniques.
Yeah, and I would say that I've lived sort of both sides of this, because I think when I was applying for a postdoc, although my skills did fit as actually it was very much a continuation, but on paper I was like a PhD in math, like that's really weird. And I've certainly hired many people whose backgrounds were like very different than what we did in the lab. For me, there's actually, that's fine. And I would don't kind of make stuff. Sorry, sometimes I get these Wi-Fi blinks. Don't like pretend you're something that you're not, because I think that's really, that comes across badly. Just say, this is my background, but have a clear answer to, I am interested in your lab because I have done this, but like a question that I'm very interested is X, and your lab does X. It's like very well positioned to answer X. I feel like I would bring some interesting complementary skills to it that would really help make that happen. And I personally look on that very favorably and I've had many people who've come in with very different backgrounds, and I view it actually as a positive. So I don't think you really need to do a lot of selling. Just be honest and enthusiastic. And show that you've done some homework. So if someone comes to my lab and is like, I'm just, as I said, like vaguely interested in your work because, I like did a Google search and your name was at the top of the list, like that's not, that doesn't come across well.
Yeah, so we actually have a lot of questions, but in the interest of time and in order to save enough time to ask open questions at the end, we're just going to, I'll hand it over to Kathy to introduce our next speaker, and then we'll have a longer Q&A session at the end.
Okay. Sunny, is it okay if I answer some by in the chat?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay. All right. I'll do that. Thanks.
We've also noticed that some people have been raising their hands, and we ask that if you can place your questions in the Q&A box as opposed to raising your hands, that would be amazing. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Kyle Hess, who is a proteomics scientist at Bristol Myers Squibb, and he'll be giving us the inside scoop on how to get an industry position when transitioning over from academia. And with that, I'll let you take it away, Kyle.
All right, awesome. Just to confirm, thank you, Kathy, for the introduction. Just to confirm, can you all see my slides in presenter mode now? Good to go. Okay, awesome. Thank you. Yeah, and I want to say thank you to Kathy and the rest of the organizing team. Thanks for the invitation to present in this seminar series. These are the kinds of things at the end of my graduate training that I found really resourceful and helped prepare me for making that transition. And so I'm hoping I can kind of pass on some of the knowledge that I've gained from other grad students and other lab members over the years. Really focus in on what I found to be, I think, 5 tips to help market yourself while you are on the job search. And so I thought, I'd start today by going to the beginning of my job search, which was about 18 months ago, where I found myself in this conundrum deciding between, do I go into academia as a postdoc or do I move into industry? And I think a lot of the fear that I had at the time was this idea in my head of this dichotomy between industry and academia, and that by joining industry, it meant that I was leaving behind all of the things that I enjoyed about academia. And I'm happy to say that 18 months later, this is definitely a misrepresentation of the two areas where life science PhDs move into. In reality, what I've found is true about industry over these last 18 months is that it's more about finding the job that is the right fit for you and allows you to continue doing some of those things that you really enjoyed in academia, but just within the industry setting and with a different end goal in mind. I mean, that is a very clear difference. With industry, the end goal is having some kind of product that you can market moving forward. But a lot of the day-to-day responsibilities and skills and tasks are very similar to what I was doing in graduate school and what I really enjoyed about graduate school. And so my goal today, I'm going to share a little bit about some of my career path towards becoming a proteomics scientist at Bristol Myers Squibb, but I want to focus most of my talk on demystifying this transition from being a graduate student or postdoc and kind of a training position and moving into industry. And so to start with my career journey so far, it's been about 12 years. So I started off back in August 2010 as an undergraduate student at Cal State Fullerton in Southern California. And I had no prior science exposure, I would say, within my kind of personal network or family network. This was really kind of a new journey for me to figure out what I wanted to do with my life. And so I started off as a kinesiology major. And it wasn't until my 3rd year in undergrad that I joined a research lab and was like, this science thing is actually really cool. And what I ended up doing from there was switching majors entirely, which extended my undergraduate education a little bit because I had to go back and do some of those entry-level courses. And during that time, decided to also do a summer undergraduate research experience at Washington University in St. Louis. And it was these 2 experiences that served as the foundation for moving into a graduate program immediately after undergrad. And I did my PhD in molecular and cellular biology at the University of Washington up in Seattle. And my advisor was Judith Vienne, where I received training in her lab in mass spectrometry, quantitative proteomics, and method development. And one thing that I have to really emphasize here is that I was incredibly fortunate to have a supportive advisor in Judith who understood that not every trainee that comes through her lab is going to end up in academia. And so she was incredibly supportive of exploring careers outside of the academic ecosystem. And because of this, I was able to explore internship opportunities at the end of grad school, where I interned at a biotech in South San Francisco called Calico in June 2021. And then this positioned me well to move into the job search afterwards. And so this has kind of been the linear version of events. I also want to paint really quickly a realistic version of events of how this really went. as I said, I started off as a kinesiology major. I thought maybe I would do physical therapy. Then I became a pre-med student. And the reality was I went into a research lab because I was like, this is what pre-med students do. And that's when I realized, oh yeah, science is pretty cool. And I went into, a lot of my ideas around what I would do as a future career were constantly changing throughout graduate school. It was something where I went in wanting to become a professor at a primarily undergraduate university or institution, or PUI. And then I, fell in love with proteomics and data science, and realized that maybe this is the career path for me. And then I realized maybe I could do omics, be an omics professor at a PUI. And so then I went through and did a teaching fellowship. Then I was looking at internships and found that Impossible Foods had an internship program for the summer. And I was like, wait, Impossible Foods does proteomics? This is so cool. And so then I went through, and that was kind of the first exposure I had in the industry and biotech scene of just how diverse the opportunities are in terms of research area within the private sector. This is something where I think my concept of industry was pretty much big pharma. I mean, it's kind of funny that I ended up at Bristol Myers Squibb, but it's something where it's a huge ecosystem of opportunities available to you. And then of course the pandemic hit. I went on to apply for the internship, and fortunately they also hung on to me over the course of a year and a half. It took a while before some of the restrictions were lifted for the internship program specifically. And so then I ended up interning at Calculator. I also want to emphasize, I was applying for postdocs too, as late as January 2022. For several reasons, some of those postdoc applications fell through, and then I found myself back at the beginning of figuring out, what do I do at this stage moving forward? And so, the first piece of advice, especially looking back at my career journey and arc so far, is that what has been the most helpful for me over time has been taking time to reflect on the training that I've received, especially during graduate school, and using this to narrow down the job search and better define what my job interests are. And like I've kind of said, the reason for this, that I really think a big piece of advice is to emphasize on defining your interests, is because of the fact that industry isn't just R&D, but it's a huge expansive ecosystem where there's so many different types of roles and job opportunities available to you, many of which are available immediately after graduate school. You have the training needed to move into a lot of these roles. And even if you don't, what people tend to do that I've seen in kind of the last year of BMS is they'll start off at the bench as scientists and then move into these other roles within the company over time. And so some of the questions that I asked myself back in January 2022 were these three specifically here, which was trying to narrow in what was it that I really enjoyed about my graduate education and training. And so the three questions I really recommend a lot of people kind of taking and looking more introspectively with is figuring out, what did you like doing in grad school? What did you not mind doing? And then what could you live without if you were looking for an ideal job? And so for me, I went through this exercise, painted a picture of what it was exactly about my training that I enjoyed. And from here, I realized a big focus for me was being able to be on the data generation side of things, but also having a lot of say in the data analysis. This was something with proteomics data. Again, I really fell in love with big data and using this for deriving biological insights. And so one worry I had was that industry meant compartmentalizing these two, and that has not been the case in my experience so far, is that there are opportunities to kind of have this mixed mode job and career where you can be at the bench and working computationally at the same time. And so for me, this then narrowed in the types of jobs that I should be applying for, at least what I wanted to apply for given my interests. And so I applied specifically to computational biology jobs and proteomics scientist jobs. And one thing I wanted to do now is kind of give you a sense of what the job search looked like starting in February 2022. And so in total, what I ended up doing was applying to one computational biology job that was solely remote. It was a data science position, and then 4 in-person proteomics scientist positions. And to give you a sense of kind of how I found these jobs, the first job was something that was referred to me by a former colleague who was working at that company at the time where the position was open. 3 of the jobs for the proteomic scientist position are ones that I found on LinkedIn, just looking at job descriptions and postings, given certain filtering criteria. And the last job was one that was shared by my advisor after she had realized I was kind of on the job search and really committed to now making this transition. And the timeline for my job search, one thing I was a little worried about after some of those postdoc applications fell through was that time was ticking. I had a defense date set of June 2022, and I needed to get a move on to really clarify what the next step was going to entail for me. And so I was a little worried about not having enough time for the job search. But in reality, what I found was that 5 to 6 month window before you defend, looking for jobs, was a really kind of a nice Goldilocks zone of not being too far out in the job search, but still allowing enough time to go through the motions and steps that are required within the industry job search. And so this is something for me where in total, for the position I got at Bristol Myers Squibb, this was about a 4 to 6 week interview cycle in total. And so the steps that I ended up doing once I found these jobs was obviously the first thing was to apply for these jobs. Everything was applied kind of digitally through LinkedIn or through not Workday, Indeed, I believe was one of the job application sites. And this then leads me to the first 2 tips that I have about marketing yourself for industry, because this is kind of the first impression where you can get your first foot in the door for these types of positions. So my first tip is that one of the key differences between applying for postdocs, for example, versus industry jobs is that you should be submitting a resume, not a CV. And there's kind of key differences between these 2 formats. Of course, a CV is going to be comprehensive. It's going to enumerate your experiences, your awards, the organizations you're a part of, the volunteering that you've done, your research publications, seminars, things like this. For industry jobs, your goal is to send an impression to people who are looking through a lot of applications that you have the qualifications necessary for the very specific job that they've posted. This is kind of the first pass screen that they're looking for. And so you should have something that's short, something that's 1 to 2 pages at most, and prioritize advertising the relevant skills front and center for the job that you are applying to. So for example, this is kind of my CV and then my resume hand in hand. These are both generated within like a 2-week time frame once I realized I was making the switch over to industry. And some of the key differences in terms of how I decided to format mine was kind of in the same structure of a job description on a job posting. So I started with a brief description and kind of a pitch for who I was, really focusing on some of the key terms and buzzwords that were kind of stand out and very clear within the job description that showed, hey, I'm a good candidate for this job. I then went into just really quickly that I had, kind of the fundamental requirements for the position. I was applying to a lot of PhD level scientist positions. So I had the educational background, baseline requirements. I then focused on the relevant skills to show I have the skills specific for this job. And this was a point where I was leaving out things. I was not trying to enumerate everything I could do, all the assays that I had done, but really trying to focus and tailor in on the specific attributes that the job was looking for. And then from there, going through and talking a bit about work experience, specifically demonstrating how I've applied these skills and trying to kind of show measurable outcomes from those skills being applied. Along these lines, I also recommend tailoring your resume to the position. So I was applying for proteomics positions and computational biology positions. Each of these, even though I used the same template, I was tailoring both of these. I was changing the summary of qualifications. Again, I was leaving out a lot of the LC-MS and mass spectrometry skills in my computational biology resume because I was trying to highlight some of the bioinformatics side of the skill set that I had developed. And again, how I was applying these skills also changed, even though the work experiences were still the same. My second tip that was kind of a struggle for me too before making this transition was trying to reframe my academic experience and my mindset. Even towards the end of grad school, how I kind of viewed myself was as this 6th-year grad student at this university in this lab with this research topic. I know how to do all these assays. I know how to write papers and teach and present posters. These are all excellent qualifications. How to finish projects, right? These are excellent qualifications for postdoc searches. But you know, at the end of this, oftentimes what I even found myself thinking is that I don't have enough industry experience to actually get these jobs immediately after grad school. And the reality couldn't be, I mean, that statement couldn't be further from the truth. The reality is that you have highly marketable skills after graduate school, even without the industry experience. And a lot of this comes down to the fact that it's not about your university, your lab, or your thesis work, but it's about the technical skills that you've gained during the process of graduate school, as well as the soft skills or kind of the personality traits and your personal fit within the group. And so how I had to start thinking of myself once I started entering the industry job market was kind of like this. This is how I framed myself, was as this computational and experimental proteomicist with 5+ years experience. Again, I was applying for jobs that had that mixed mode dimension to them where I could still do data generation and data analysis. And then I focused on all of those things that you learn in grad school, like project management, problem solving and troubleshooting, data generation, QC analysis and reporting, summarizing proteomics findings to project teams. This is a core part of my day-to-day job now. And I was doing it all the time before in grad school, but I never really thought about it in that same context or same light. Things like maintaining instrumentation, establishing workflows. And this was a key one too, is taking those skill sets that I learned and trying to reframe it in the context of applications that industry would be interested in. So for me, I was applying for a lot of biotech and pharmaceutical job postings. And so a lot of the nature of that work is doing things like drug target deconvolution or investigating MOAs. And so while maybe I didn't do that explicitly within my work for applications in drug development, it's still something that I had all the necessary skills to basically plug and play from the academic environment into the industry environment. Of course, like I said, there's a lot of different job roles out there in industry. So how you frame and market your skills will depend a lot on the roles you apply to. And you know, how you actually go about translating these skills into more industry type lingo is something that I'll mention at the end. There's a resource I used that was absolutely awesome. It was a kind of a 1-week workshop, and I highly recommend if you have time and you're interested in industry, exploring that option. And so that was just the first step. That was applying for the jobs. From here, what needed to happen was that I would be contacted by a recruiter for the company. And this was either by email or by phone call. Sometimes I was kind of caught off guard because I got a phone call and I totally didn't realize, like, once you put applications out there, be ready for phone calls, have your phone ready. Don't put it on silent, and be available to kind of pick up those phone calls, because urgency is a big part of it as well. And this kind of leads me into my third tip, which is that at each step in the interview, put your best foot forward. And I mention this here because even at the stage where the recruiters are reaching out to you, these are opportunities to connect with potential future colleagues, and they are assessing kind of who you are, even at these early stages. And the key thing that I've realized throughout this interview process, very similar to the postdoc search, is that just like in academia, in industry, the majority of people that you're going to be interviewing are not professional interviewers. They are other people that, you know, are just scientists, where this is just a part of their job, where they're expanding their team. And so really at each step in the interview process, make sure you take those opportunities to connect. Don't dismiss any interview as being unimportant. Show them that you're a good personality fit for their team specifically. And so from here, after having this initial contact by these recruiters, typically this was just to make sure that, you know, I was a real person, and then that, you know, what was the best way to stay in contact with me. And usually this was then to set up the initial interview with the hiring manager for these positions. And from here, this usually was a 30-minute to 45-minute phone call with the hiring manager, where they would explain what the role is. They would do a few kind of entry-level interview questions of you, like, tell me about yourself, and kind of also give you a sense of what the position entails. and what their setup looks like within their team and within their group. And as long as everything looks good there, and you're connecting with these individuals, and you have those qualifications, this tended to lead to a full interview later on. As you can see from my computational biologist role, instead of interviewing with the hiring manager, I first interviewed with the recruiter. And then at that stage, it became very clear that there was a big difference in terms of what I had anticipated the job requiring as a skill set versus what they were specifically looking for. And so at that stage, they kind of decided not to continue with my application and move on with other candidates. Totally understandable. This happens. Sometimes job descriptions aren't entirely clear in terms of what specific qualifications they're looking for. And so for the full interview, kind of give you an idea of what these tended to look like. Usually you'd start with a morning seminar, about an hour. And from there, for the next 5 to 6 hours, you would break into small groups and kind of interview different people that are a part of the team, that are adjacent to the team, that are within kind of the cubicle spaces. Really, again, a big part, kind of like what Dr. Raj was saying earlier, is getting a sense of how well are you going to fit within this group, not just within the team you're working for, but also within the larger company culture. And one thing that was really nice about these interviews is they would usually send you a list of people you're going to speak with ahead of time. If you get this list in whatever jobs you're applying for, I recommend going through and kind of reading up a little bit, or trying to get a sense of who these individuals are. Who are you meeting with? What is their background? What kind of teams, based off LinkedIn searches or anything like this, what kind of background do you think they have? Just to give you a sense of how those interviews might go. And at this stage, these are my final 2 tips for the full interview. These are 2 tips that I received before going into these full interviews that I think really helped as well with marketing myself and standing out. The first tip for going into this full interview is use this as another opportunity to broadcast your relevant skills and to kind of give voice to your resume. This is something that the hiring team, they're going to have your resume, they're going to have your cover letter, they're going to have access to all of these things that you've submitted. But this is yet another opportunity to, again, give voice to some of those specific proteomic skills, or contextualize it or reframe it, depending on what kind of jobs you're applying for. And so this is something where I had a slide at the beginning that kind of outlined what my background and training was in terms of university and labs that I worked in, and then breaking it down into some of the experimental workflows that I have training in, what kind of instrumentation I have experience with. And that's part of the reason for that, was because that was a core part of the job that I was applying for. And then also some of the data analysis and bioinformatics sides of things. So I have a slide like this at the beginning, and then just to, again, showcase that I have the skill sets that they are looking for. And then my last tip, and this was kind of the most difficult, I think, for me at times, is one of the things that is a key difference, I think, I shouldn't say it's a key difference between academia and industry, but something I've noticed with the industry setting is that there is a big emphasis on that skill set and the qualifications for the specific job you're applying for. And so when you go into that morning seminar and you have an opportunity to present your science, I recommend presenting your approach to science, and try not to be too attached to the specific thesis work or the specific biological question that you're presenting. It's really about an opportunity to show the types of experimental workflows that you can implement and how you've applied them specifically. And so for me, for example, what I ended up doing was I started my seminar with a slide showing the broad scope of my thesis work and emphasizing each of the individual research areas where my skills have been applied. And from here, I then transitioned into, all right, now here are 3 specific vignettes or projects or studies that illustrate different facets of my skill set, and stringing these together in a somewhat semi-cohesive story if you're able to. And so as you can see here, I kind of, again, because this was a mixed mode kind of position, I focused on the technology development, the assay development, and importantly, the application side as well of how I applied these assays to biological questions. The other thing I want to emphasize is that it's also totally okay to acknowledge and highlight the collaborations that you've done during the course of graduate school, especially in this seminar. The important thing to remember is that if you do highlight the collaborations that you've been a part of, be specific about what your contribution was to that collaboration or what your task was with that collaboration. Because oftentimes collaborations, I think get associated with a distributed responsibility and work, and it's kind of hard to figure out, well, what did the candidate actually do in this collaboration? And so that's where being specific, I think, helps clarify any of that and not get any of that mixed up. And so that's kind of how the job search went. At the end of those 5 jobs, I ended up getting 2 job offers around the same time. Again, it was about a month long. And then by the beginning of April, I had accepted one of the jobs, which is BMS. And yeah, fortunately, again, I had some time to kind of finish my thesis and then move from Seattle to San Diego to start my next job in August 2022. And last thing I want to mention too, as kind of a bonus tip as I'm finishing up here, is it's all about selling your qualifications as a candidate, but also be honest about your skill set. You don't have to be an expert in everything for the position. What the employers want to know is what areas do you have expertise in? And then what areas are you able to learn quickly if needed? And finally, what areas would you need additional training, which would then, they would have a lot of considerations about. But my advice really is be honest about your skill set. And the reason for this is that even if you oversell kind of one thing that you're an expert in, it's something that can then call into question the rest of the application. And so that's kind of the situation that I would say you'd want to avoid in general. And so with that, that's kind of the end of my talk. I just wanted to highlight a few additional resources that helped me with making this transition, making these mindset shifts. PsyPhD was the workshop that I did. Absolutely phenomenal. I really enjoy it. And they host several workshops throughout the years. Oftentimes, academic institutions and state level biotech organizations will actually host and fund a lot of these workshops so that you can attend it for free as a trainee. Also, there's so much advice out there on the transition. One that I actually have found to be very helpful is this blog for this Twitter account called Life After My PhD. A specific website's listed there. I do not personally know this person. It's just as I was kind of looking through her posts, I was like, yeah, this is totally true. And of course, your network as an additional source. Other grad students, alumni from your department, looking on LinkedIn to see if you have any like associated people within your network that are with the companies that you're applying to. And also feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. I'm happy to keep these conversations going. Just be sure to mention where we've met, because sometimes I'll get connections and I don't know who the person is. So I'm like, I don't know what to do. Anyways, that's all. Thank you all for your time. Happy to answer questions.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Hess, for that lovely talk. It was very enlightening and clearly a very successful job search on your end, and it's great to see. We do have a couple questions coming in the Q&A section, and I'm just going to start us off here. It seems like there are so many diverse industry positions and there can be a lot of industry jargon. How did you narrow down which jobs to apply for? Did you do any informational interviews, and would you recommend that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, I was fortunate to have that internship towards the end of graduate school. That was a really insightful experience, because what that allowed me to do was be in a biotech setting, albeit Calico is a very academic biotech, but they still had the same infrastructure that other biotechs and industries have, which is all those different roles and responsibilities. And so I used that as an opportunity to set up informational interviews with people within that company. And so if you don't have access to something like an internship kind of in your back pocket, this is where I think LinkedIn becomes really helpful, and just tapping into your network of individuals that you know. Something I've learned over the years is that science is a really small world, even though it seems so expansive. So even though you may think like your network is just like your lab or your PI, like the combination of people they know really expands your network. above and beyond just your immediate locality. So definitely would recommend just like setting up those informational interviews, and sometimes just cold messaging or emailing people that are in a role that seems interesting, and maybe you haven't heard before, or like maybe it's like, you know, yeah, just sounds interesting, and you won't always have that that luck with maybe getting a response back, but when you do, it's great. Yeah, on top of that, I think I definitely recommend, another plug for the PhD workshop. The other nice thing there is that they also plug you into this really expansive network. Again, it's not just something that's focused on doing bench jobs in industry, but their big focus is just getting you into industry after grad school, be it as like a medical science liaison, a bench scientist, going into IP law, things like this. So yeah, hopefully that answers the question, but happy to chat more.
Yes, thank you for sharing those resources. Another question is, how feasible is it to obtain an industry role after a short postdoc for an international candidate on visas like J1? This one might be slightly specific. Or how supportive, in your experience, are companies to sponsor someone?
That is a great question, and it's totally outside of my wheelhouse.
Okay.
I'm really sorry. So I'm coming up on a year now at VMS, but there's nobody that I've interacted with directly that can speak to that experience. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, no worries. What would you advise if you do not have as many skills after graduate school? Would you go for a postdoc or not?
Yeah, so I think there's two parts to that question. First, I would counter that you don't have too many skills. So this is definitely a big mindset shift. Like, there are a ton of skills that you're developing, even kind of in the background, maybe subconsciously, by going through graduate school. And so one of the first things is to really sit down and try and reframe some of those skills, not just the technical skills, but a big part of industry is kind of the soft skills, the people management skill, the people interaction skills that you develop along the way as, you know, being a grad student as a part of a cohort within a lab ecosystem, things like this. And then the second part is that, yeah, I think the other thing that you have to consider when deciding to do a postdoc is what kind of skill sets, if your end goal is industry in mind, I would recommend choosing postdocs that complement the skills that you already have, that set you up for that next step. Kind of like Arjun was saying, you know, postdocs are temporary positions. They're supposed to be training positions. And so if your end goal is industry, but you feel like you don't have the skill sets for a specific type of biotech job, yes, the postdoc is definitely an opportunity to now complement what you view as the requirements for that transition into industry. But as life happens, right, like oftentimes things change with time. So yeah, it's good to be forward thinking in terms of what kind of biotech job you'd like, and then thinking about the postdoc from that context. I will say one thing I didn't talk about was that the two postdoc positions that I applied to were exactly within this framework. My idea was to go for these postdocs that were specifically in an area of genomics that was outside of my proteomics wheelhouse, to get some experience with sequencing and working with sequencing data so that I could then move into industry on the data science side for more multi-omics types positions.
All right. Due to time constraints, I think we are going to wrap up the seminar here. Both of the speakers have kindly left their contact information in their presentations or in the chat, so feel free to reach out to them in those platforms. And with that, I'd just like to send a big thank you on behalf of the IUBMB Trainee Committee to both Dr. Hess and Dr. Raj for their time, and as well to all of our attendees at our seminar today. Thank you so much for coming, and stay tuned to the IUBMB socials for future events. Have a great day.